September, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the teaching of religious studies here at New College. And who better to tell us about that than our very own Dr. Steve Sutcliffe, who is Senior Lecturer in the Study of Religion. And his topic is 50 Years of Religious Studies at New College, 1971 to 2021. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, 50 years of religious studies at New College, a snapshot. I added that little bit because actually it's just going to be too unwieldy otherwise. So you'll be relieved to know it is a snapshot rather than the full Monty, as it were. 50 years of religious studies from the end of the long 1960s, in Arthur Marwick's phrase, to the third decade of the 21st century, which is what this period spans, would take some telling. Well, the next 20 minutes is a good chance to recall some of the highlights from that journey, since, as Professor Bond just alluded to, not only is 2021 the 175th anniversary of the founding of New College, it marks 50 years of religious studies undergraduate degree teaching here, and also, as it happens, 10 years of the master's teaching program, which was begun in 2011. Eric Sharp says in his magisterial volume Comparative Religion, History, that, quote, both the history of religion and the history of the study of religion must be regarded as social history. My version of the social history must be selective, and I look forward to the emails and questions putting me right. But I thought I'd ease into the topic on a personal note, since disciplinary histories are always tied up in part with life stories, and life stories are at the centre of struggles to secure academic tenure in any field, not just religious studies. So my own first contact with New College was in early 1991, when I approached the late Alistair Key and indeed Professor Ruth Page, who we've just heard about the possibility of taking a master's degree in religious studies. They were encouraging about my eternal student status, because I was then nearly 30 and mature students at that time were still a bit of a rarity. But they could only suggest that I enroll as an undergraduate on the undergraduate program. My BA in Russian apparently wasn't much use in the study of religion. Then, a little bit disheartened, but luckily I discovered Stirling ran an MPhil in religious studies. 1991 was its last year, and I enrolled as the only student. My next contact with New College was in September 1993, when I met Dr. James Cox, now Professor Emeritus, in Sunderland at the British Association for the Study of Religion's annual conference. For the first time, and not for the last, I heard Jim speak about phenomenology of religion. He had just published his book, Expressing the Sacred, an introduction to the phenomenology of religion with Zimbabwe University Press. And in fact, Jim had been teaching in Zimbabwe for many years and was just about then starting the African Christianity Project in New College with the late Jack Thompson. I've got a couple of slides here just with book covers for a bit of illustration. There's Jim's book from 1992 in its Zimbabwe University Press edition, Expressing the Sacred. We'll come on to the other picture in just a minute. This conjunction of phenomenology as method, indigenous religion, in fact, Shona people in Zimbabwe as subject, and a good working relationship between religious studies and the Centre for World Christianity was to mark out much of the character of religious studies in its kind of mid-cycle of its teaching program in the late 1990s into the early 2000s. So I met Dr. Jim Cox. Meanwhile, on a very different track, I got to know the late Elizabeth and Douglas Templeton through my wife's family. In 1994, Douglas asked the Cayley Band, in which I eked out my student years as a PhD student, to play at Paul's for the conference of, and my Latin's not great, bear with me, Studiorum Novi Testamenti Societas, which Douglas was organising. Douglas also wanted a Scottish poet for the interval, so I phoned the late Edwin Morgan, who shyly read some of his complex poems very quickly, quietly, in a mumbly voice to a puzzled international audience. I didn't feel I could interrupt the future Scotland Mackay, the national poet, to ask him to stop mumbling and to speak up. Fortunately, the Cayley Band, I think, saved the day with a strict willow, and I'm reliably informed by head of school that this has still been a memorable conference event of SNTS. Anyway, there is a point to this. After several years scraping by on part-time tutoring and temporary appointments, aided by income from gigs at prestigious venues like Kirkcaldy Rugby Club and the Golden Lion in Stirling, I was appointed lecturer in Religion and Society here in January 2005. And 16 years later, 1/3 of the Life of Religious Studies teaching programme, which is hard to believe, I'm still here. So I sympathise very much with PhD students, mature students and others who have to struggle by on scraps of scholarship, tutoring, part-time jobs, all the while juggling family commitments and often international residency. Even then after that to find a job, but it can be done. So the personal is economic and political, but the personal is also methodological. And I inherited this passion in matters methodological from my PhD supervisor at the Open University, Dr. Terry Thomas, who helped me conceive of religious studies as both an empirical and a theoretical enterprise. Not only that, but the empirical material, the data if you like, needed to be cross-culturally based and approached comparatively for maximum payoff. And this kind of position, I think, has broadly characterised religious studies at Edinburgh, and indeed internationally. For in many ways, Edinburgh is a microcosm of the international field through scholarly associations like the British Association and the International Association for the History of Religions. And we'll get on to the specifically Edinburgh story in just a minute. But first then, now we move into the more institutional teaching picture, it's important to note briefly that religious studies after the 1960s, it started in 1971 in Edinburgh, as we know already, and we'll flesh out in a minute. It didn't come from nowhere. In the big picture, it emerged from what was called science of religion or comparative religion in the late Victorian period and after. Indeed, I would go as far as to argue that there's a loose Scottish tradition of comparative religion. This would include, for example, the noted Islamicists William Muir and William Montgomery Watt, more recently, who, as we shall see, had a role in the early days of Edinburgh religious studies, but also the scholar of Taoism from Aberdeen, James Lay. Other early texts in this broad, loose tradition of Scottish comparative religion could include studies in the philosophy of religion and history by the Congregationalist Andrew Fairbairn, who was born in Inverkeithing and was later the first principal of Mansfield College, Oxford. Also in this genealogy could be History of Religion, a sketch of primitive religious beliefs and practices and of the origin and character of the great systems by Alan Mingus, Professor of Biblical Criticism at St Andrews, which Eric Sharp, in his aforementioned Comparative Religion and History, considers, quote, the first genuinely Scottish handbook of comparative religion. A very important volume, much admired by the French scholars Marcel Mauss and Ibn Durkheim, was, of course, Lectures on the Religion of the Semites, written by the Professor of the Free Church College in Aberdeen, William Robertson Smith. Also significant is J.G. Fraser's The Golden Bough, a massive and, of course, now much criticised work, but in its heyday of wide influence. Fraser was a friend of Robertson Smith and a graduate of Glasgow, and he turned down the new chair in comparative religion in Manchester in 1904, which was the first such chair in the UK. In 1923, this chair was taken by the Scottish missionary J.N. Farquhar, author of Primer of Hinduism in 1911 and Modern Religious Movements in India in 1915. But arguably the finest output in modern parlance of the Scottish comparative religion tradition was the 12-volume Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, 1908 to 26, edited over the last 14 years of his life. That's 2 breath spans in modern speak, by Free Church minister James Hastings, based in St Cyrus in Angus. Hastings was already a prolific editor, and the Expository Times, which he founded in 1889, is now, of course, based here in the college. And he was doing this editorial work before he began on the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, which Eric Sharp rightly considers, quote, in its day the epitome of European scholarship at its best. And a case might be made for including in this tradition of Scottish comparative religion Roderick Ninian Smart. Although born in Cambridge, Smart's parents were Scottish. He was baptised in the Episcopal Church and he attended Glasgow Academy from 1937. Smart's self-description as, quote, a Scottish Episcopalian by birth and adherence, Taoist by temperament, and also as, quote, a high Anglican Buddhist globalist, end quote, tells us expansively something about the pluralist and comparative model of religious studies that Smart embodied in the department he helped launch at Lancaster in 1967, which in many ways is the ancestral shrine of religious studies in the UK. So Smart might be loosely on the fringes of this tradition. So that's the kind of sketch of this pre-history of what starts to happen from the late 60s onwards. If Lancaster is the ancestral shrine of the UK, I think Edinburgh actually runs Lancaster very close, certainly in Scotland, although it was not the first such programme here in Scotland. Glasgow was running what was called a Principles of Religion degree from 1961 to 62, and Aberdeen was 1 year ahead of Edinburgh with its religious studies teaching programmes in 1970. Nevertheless, Edinburgh is the longest running continuous religious studies degree programme in Scotland. So how did this programme come about? In 1968, October 1968, William Montgomery Watt in Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies remarked to Senatus on what he called, quote, a gap in the present teaching of the Faculty of Arts in respect to the study of religion from a scientific, factual, or neutral standpoint. Watt proposed a new religious studies programme beginning with 2 ordinary courses to address, quote, problems raised for religious belief by the physical sciences, biology, sociology, psychology, and philosophy, by Marxist, Freudian, and humanist critiques of religion, the mutual relations of the great religions in the later 20th century, and some detailed factual study of at least 2 of the great religions. Imagine doing all that in 2 ordinary courses, but you can see in many ways that he was prescient, but we'll come to that. Next year, a few months later, in February 1969, an MA Religious Studies programme was proposed to the Faculty of Divinity by Professor John McIntyre, who we've already heard plenty about. It would be divided into 4 groups. Group A would be Biblical Studies, Hebrew and Greek, with options in Arabic and Sanskrit. Group B would be history, including ecclesiastical history, British and European history, African history, Scottish history, archaeology and history of science. Group C would be theology, ethics and philosophy. Group D would be Christian education, pastoral care, church and society, and other social sciences. So it's interesting at this very early stage to compare the content of these proposals from 2 eminent academics in different schools, but would come to be in the same college effectively. Watt's proposal, as I've said, is prescient in one sense, and it's what we might call problem-based concern for interdisciplinary inquiry and methodological interaction, placing much less weight on discrete, quote-unquote, world religions than is typical during this period. In many ways, Watt anticipates some of the current debates on the shape of religious studies. McIntyre's proposal is more conservative in certain areas, but does expand language studies to include Arabic and Sanskrit, and, interestingly, presents quite a radical historical remit by including African history, Scottish history, archaeology, and history of science in these new courses. In the event, a BA Religious Studies degree along McIntyre's lines was duly introduced to New College in 1971. In 1973, this expanded into a 4-year MA Honours degree based in a revised curriculum with courses in both religions in one stream and in methodology on the other. Religions included Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, Shinto, and African religions, some of which we've lost along the way since then, while methodology included skills in philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and history. Elizabeth Templeton had initial responsibility for coordinating the two main introductory courses called Comparative Religion and Religious Studies, respectively. The next main development in the story came in 1973, when Frank Whalen, author of this other book in the slide here, The World's Religious Traditions, a little bit later on, was appointed to develop this new religious studies program. Born in 1934, Professor Whaling was an enthusiastic scholar with wide international interests. He'd studied in Harvard with Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was author of the classic 1962 study The Meaning and End of Religion, and Frank Whaling went on to edit several important methodological collections while he was based in Edinburgh, including the 2 volumes of Contemporary Approaches to the Study of Religion, Volume 1, The Humanities, and Volume 2, The Social Sciences, in the mid-1980s, and indeed especially The World's Religious Traditions in honour of Wilfred Campbell Smith, the Canadian Islamicist and comparative religion scholar. And Frank Whaling was an early advocate, actually, for the study of religions as a globalised project. He'd had experience as a missionary in India, and he was very keen to place the comparative study of religions on a truly global scale. And as many of you know, he was also a keen promoter of interfaith relations, founding the Edinburgh Interfaith Association in 1989. So with Frank Whaling on board with a brief specifically to develop this programme, by the mid-1980s enrolment in Religious Studies MA and BA was growing, and it was supported here, it was helped here by a close relationship with Islamic and Middle Eastern studies under Montgomery Watt, who, as we've seen, was a key figure in the early discussions about introducing some kind of a programme in Edinburgh, and also in Asian studies through John Brockington and then later Paul Dundas. Now, the scope of the programme was broadened further in 1987 when Professor Andrew Waltz, who we've also heard about today in very interesting ways, Andrew Waltz moved the Centre for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World to New College from Aberdeen. Although the centre, as we know, was primarily postgraduate and postdoctoral, it introduced an interest or a section in those days in what was called, quote-unquote, primal religions into the undergraduate curriculum, and also helped to reposition the study of Christianity in a more global context, including the new journal from 1995, Studies in World Christianity. And of course, the centre also made majority world students a much more visible presence in the new college community. So more diversity, if you like, was brought in to the religious studies programme, broadly conceived and speaking by the arrival of Andrew Walls at the centre in the late 1980s. Also at this time, in 1988, Professors Alistair Key and Nicholas Wyatt joined Edinburgh Religious Studies from the Glasgow Principles of Religion department, which I mentioned had been going actually since the early 1960s. A very interesting story in itself. Course options now increased further through the combined studies stream, which was initiated by Alistair Key. Now religious studies students on the religious studies programmes could take courses in archaeology, art, classics, history, music, etc. through the various schools in the college, while at the same time they could specialise in 1 or 2 religious traditions, including Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Chinese religions, ancient Near Eastern religions with Nicholas Wyatt, as well, of course, as Christianity and Judaism. So Frank Whaling, in his 1996 piece about religious studies at the occasion of the 150th anniversary of New College, is probably correct to say that, round about the late 1980s, Edinburgh had the widest course in religious studies in the UK. Student numbers grew, so students seemed to like this. By 1993, the first year course in religious studies had jumped to well over 100 students, and in 1996, on the 150th anniversary of New College, Whaling reports that around 40 students were enrolling on the BA/MA programmes. This increase in numbers affected the makeup of the student body also. Whaling reports that a small but continuing number of students were Jews, Muslims and Buddhists who offered to the new college community contact with people outside the Christian tradition. Others had an academic and often existential interest in religion that was not necessarily linked to an identifiable institution. This diversity in worldview, if you like, amongst the student body, Whaling pointed to 25 years ago, has undoubtedly increased over the last 20 years, during my time here, with many undergraduates perhaps identifying as pagan, spiritual, or humanist, as well as showing increased empathy with the decolonising struggles of indigenous religions. In 1999, Frank Whaling retired and James Cox was appointed reader in religious studies. In 2000, two anthropologists joined, Dr. Jean Openshaw with fieldwork experience in West Bengal and Dr. Elizabeth Kirpin, cross-appointed to the Centre for World Christianity and to Religious Studies with fieldwork experience in Borneo. Courses in indigenous religion started to solidify and consolidate as quite a popular option, boosted by the new anthropological expertise brought by Jean and by Elizabeth, as well as, of course, by Jim Cox's work in African indigenous religions. I've got a few more pics here to keep you going to the final film. There we are. Just I mean, it's invidious to make selections with lots of colleagues who are still around. I've stuck my neck out just for a few to give you a hint of some of the diversity that starts to come in the early 2000s. Athea Adogany's Africa and Scotland, Scotland in Africa, an edited collection there a bit later into the 2000s. Jean's Seeking More Bowels of Bengal there in 2002, if I remember rightly, and Elizabeth Kirping's essays Food, Friends and Funerals, the topic of lived religions being opened up there. Also joining soon after, in 2005, were Dr. Hannah Holtschneider in Modern Judaism, later Jewish Studies, and indeed Dr. Athea Adogany, with his book there pictured on the left, cross-appointed to the Centre for World Christianity, but with religious studies specialisations in religious movements in Africa and in the African diaspora. So this was in many ways a heyday of religious studies in the early first decade, perhaps of the 2000s into the second decade. Other appointments followed as religious studies continued to diversify and in many ways to specialise. Increasing specialisation starts to come in. Dr. Christian Lange in Islamic Studies, now professor at Utrecht. Dr. Akton Lonkuma in Anthropology of South Asian Indigenous Religions after Jan Openshaw retired. And Dr. Naomi Appleton in Buddhist Studies. Another slide to keep you going. Yeah, there are some of our colleagues' more recent work. Anna Holtschneider's book on Jewish Orthodoxy in Scotland there, in the Scottish Religious Culture series. Naomi Appleton's discussion of karma and rebirth there, Buddhist and Jain multi-life stories. Recent publication by Akton Lonkuma on Hindutva and political religious struggles in the northeast of India. And I'll mention the last thing just at the end, because it brings in the student population to round off. In recent years, religious studies also recruited two Lever Hugh Murley Career Fellows, Dr. Chris Cotter on Unbelief and Irreligion in Scotland and Northern Ireland, who is now an IASH Fellow, and Dr. Claire Wanworth, who's currently researching climate activism and religion in Edinburgh and London, with a particular focus on the Religious Society of Friends. Islamic studies, always a key part of the programme since the early involvement of Montgomery Watt and long relationships with IMESH, or Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, expanded with the appointment in 2011 of Professor Mona Siddiqui as Chair in Islamic and Interreligious Studies. Professor Siddiqui was joined later by Dr. Joshua Ralston and then more recently in 2019 by Dr. Shadab Rahmatullah, helping to open up a new field in Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations, and a long-standing relationship between religious studies and the Centre for once new study of Christianity in the non-Western world, and the Centre for the Study of World Christianity, which refreshed with the arrival in 2017 of Dr. Emma Wine. And I'll finish with a note about the students, because in all of this, of course, religious studies has been lucky, honoured, one might say, to have several generations of lively and inquisitive students pass through our courses and our programmes, our lifelong. Many have gone on to various non-academic pursuits, and I still receive requests for references from several years back, as I'm sure many of us in the room do as well. Others went on to master's programmes here and elsewhere, and several have taken PhDs here. Many of our PhD students have given us fantastic service in the teaching programme through tutoring and occasional lecturing, and two of our former students, Drs. David Robertson, who did a PhD here, Dr. Chris Cotter, who did a Master's by Research here, set up the Religious Studies Project, badge in the bottom right-hand corner there, in 2012 as an international podcast-led forum with a particular focus on and for early career scholars. Well, to conclude, and this really is a brief conclusion, sometimes people say, I'm going to conclude now, and there's about 2 pages of discussion, but this is 4 lines. The late Jonathan Z. Smith, and there have been a few late colleagues in this paper, Professor of History of Religions at Chicago for many years, pithily described the purpose of the study of religion in 5 words: training in argument without interpretation. Religious Studies at Edinburgh has done a lot of this over the last 50 years, and we hope and we aim to do a lot more over the next 50. And this sketch is itself a new piece of data ripe for interpretation, more grist to the mill.